So a little bit about me so you understand how I've been navigating the world and being an artist. So I actually have lived all over the planet nearly. I was born in Africa and then I migrated back to India, lived in different places there. Migrated to New Zealand. Then I was in the US. I lived on a beef organic farm in Upper Austria. And then found my way back to India, and now I live between India and New Zealand. So not in the ocean, but literally between the two countries. I get that often. But what I realized was, like, living through all these spaces, I changed and I morphed and I evolved, and my consciousness sort of spread in a lot of different ways. And I started thinking, like, and this was right after when I moved from India to New Zealand, and that was a major shift in my life, was how experiences and spaces affect us and evolve us. And I've been constantly, as an artist, since that day, like since these thoughts started popping in, I wanted to build spaces where people could experience things and somehow just, I don't think I want to change the world per se, but at least people trigger some notions and emotions and questions and take them into spaces where they haven't been. And that's why today I just sort of gave an umbrella topic, which was experiential landscapes. Though I do work in a lot of spaces. So I started out as a painter and a printmaker and a photographer. Then went on to do my master's in something called experimental animation and film. And you have to understand, in school I was confused whether I wanted to be a programmer or an artist. And my father said, you're an artist, go to art school, which is quite unique by itself and very supportive. So I find myself back in Cal Arts, and this is the first time I started using real technology, because in MSU Baroda we didn't even have a projector. It was just a 16mm projection film back in 2000 to 2003, no computers, no nothing. So start incorporating more and more technology, and what I start really realizing is, I think there's a geek in me, like a big one, and I'm going to tap in. So what you're going to see is filmmaking, you're going to see community art projects that I have engaged in, and now I've been working with interactive electronics and art and building these landscapes. So I'm going to start off with my next slide. So what you're going to see is my first film, and I'm going to dive right into it. It's called Birth of Brainfly. This is the first film I ever animated, but you have to see these two projects are an 8-year-long project. So when I dedicate myself to something, I really investigate the language. So this got inspired through me moving from India to New Zealand, and I started building these landscapes in my brain. So, and I built a character called Brainfly, which evolved and moved. When it went through these different landscapes, it evolved and moved. It started out when I was painting, and I could see all my paintings move and evolve, and so I started building narratives within my paintings, and I felt like it was time to move on and change my technique, and started getting into experimental animation. So I've never done per se techniques because I needed to. It's just because my imagination ran in a particular direction, I had to learn it. So that's always been a driving force in my life. What I realized through the process of filmmaking was that I could enter into spaces where we couldn't really express certain things through words, and you could read spaces and explore them through visuals and sound. And so I started getting into sound through filmmaking. I realized the power of collaboration. And what happens, as most artists, we land up living in very insular worlds. Nothing wrong with that. But I realized for myself, I really enjoyed the joy working with different people and really like getting the best out of them and figuring out how to work with human dynamics. And it really opened a whole new spectrum for me as an artist. I was invited for a solo show right after I finished these films in India. And I landed up making a walkthrough of all the storyboards. So the paintings went in and out so that people could process each segment and then finally view the film. Now, the film is not meant to be viewed on just a single screen. It's at least 3 to 4 screen projections, like an immersive experience. So then I can play around with what appears when, in which direction. So these are just glimpses I just made them nearly black and white. Okay, so there's a lot of detail work in there, but when you photograph them from a distance, it's very difficult to catch that. It's just that I just wanted the very pure value of the form. I didn't want many color distractions. So my inspiration sort of into electronics was, one was this. Two was I had sort of gotten into this, after films and getting sort of the immersive experience, I wanted to get into more an interaction sort of space. And this propelled me further. And I was like, this had culminated 8 years, Brainfly is dead. What's next? And I sort of had moved back to India post this show as an experiment, and I didn't know what I was really like looking for. So I thought I'm going to surrender to what the universe provides me for a whole year. And a lot of interesting projects came out of that, and I landed up doing some commercial installations which started out from Bombay Electric, and from there people sort of saw what the mediums that I could play with, and I got invited for this community art project in Harvey, which was funded by the Wellcome Trust. It was through an NGO called Sneha, which worked for women health and nutrition, and it was a 1-year project. When Sneha approached me, they wanted me to work on women health and nutrition, and I had to educate myself. I was just like, okay, this is a totally new space for me. I want to see what they are interested. It's also, I was going to be more in the position of an artist curator, which meant like there were 3 different workshops going to be not below, but like fundamentally I had to bring 3 different workshops together, which was based on photography, textile, and Kumbharwara is basically the clay. People working with clay in Dharavi, which is a huge space by itself there. And my role was to guide these workshops and bring them ultimately to a large installation or a small or whatever we landed up building towards the end. I was like, what is the most common thing that we have in our lives that we share? I mean, that can communicate right across. And I thought home, a notion of a home exists everywhere. Whether it's even a beggar on the street, they'll have objects which define some sort of existence, their own personal items. And so what I landed up doing was, first I got all the women, the people in the group to come together from the 3 different workshops and map their houses, literally draw their houses with the objects and placements. And from that I pulled out all these common objects and asked them to tell a story about their life through those objects. So whether it was the bed or the television or, and initially there was in order to bring in an abstract concept to be planted on an object was hard. But out of that I got 2 very successful stories, and one was related to the gas, and she equated to domestic violence in her house. And the other one was, it was very simple. It was like a good window and a bad window, and the good window was what she wanted to see outside of Dharavi from her own house and what she saw. After all of that, I started gathering all these objects from second-hand places. We recycled everything, and we gathered all the objects, and that propelled further. I mean, once the objects became more tactile, they started building the installations over it, and ideas were flowing freely. They started connecting to everything. So I'm just going to start drifting into what the installation landed up looking like. So this was a 60 feet by 80 feet installation. And it was like this floating house landscape where everything inside was outside and outside was inside. We chose this aquamarine color because most houses in Dharavi choose green, blues as a way of having a cooling experience during the hot summer. So the bed the bed was about all the family members that they had to share their bed with, whether it was, and how many people were sleeping. 2 stories like talking about like, what is the definition of rape? Can the husband rape a woman? To basically what kind of, fertility measures could one take? So it's sort of it would be like an open, choose the topic as bed today, and there would be these kinship of women who would communicate all these topics. And in fact, some of this, like, it would be very interesting because what I would learn would be like sometimes superstitions, sometimes facts, sometimes contraceptives that I had not even ever heard of. So it became like the younger women and the older women all engaging and learning together in this space. And it had become a space of kinship, a space of support, a space of sharing. And that's how we all grew. Side along so we formed like groups, and there was another young girl who started to explore like domestic violence, but she said, I'm going to get stories of women on chapatis. And I said, okay, but you have not faced domestic violence, like, so how can you be true to your cause? Like, what she said, okay, what I'm going to do then is, because I'm not, I'm going to go and I'm going to interview different women who've experienced all these issues, and I'm going to write down their stories. So we had one of those, in Harvey there are these legit papad. There's a big papad comes out of Harvey basically. And so we took one of those baskets and all these stories came out of that. Now all these installations were actually titled by the women themselves, and they chose to title it with Bollywood names. I mean, Bollywood like runs in the veins there. So The Dirty Picture. Or like you saw in the larger scale, the zoomed out the teacup with the sugar. We were talking about sugar problems and all. It's called Chini Kam, which is another, I mean, it equates to something else, but this was a very interesting photograph. We're talking about old age problems and also how older generations are losing their homes within Harvey. They're being chucked out by their families, so discussing that. And when they get chucked out, she's a woman who sat outside her house on the opposite side of the street in front of this shutter. Day-to-day ends would see her family move in and out of the house. So just bringing up these moments, these stories and narrations which these women captured. These were self-portraits, and again talking about health and nutrition. So that's why, and prenatal health and nutrition, because that's what Harvey massively dealt with. Sneha. BioMercury is a philosophy where they believe nature is a technology by itself, and it has resolved, as it's a sustainable environment, it's resolved most of the ecological issues that our technology hasn't dealt with. So what it states is that we need to mimic, as humans, our technology needs to mimic nature, which is a technology by itself, because it's already resolved all these issues. So this was a poetic representation of biomimicry. I wouldn't say I'm mimicking it. So for example, biomimicry would be like you seeing the shells. Now shells have calcium deposits. Okay, so if you take that same thing, rather than putting chemicals in your drains, you mimic that same way the shells are clearing out their calcium in the drainage systems, which is a more sort of symbiotic way, not symbiotic, but more sustainable way of looking at our ecology. Now this bottle encased, the whole idea when I started out making was that it's going to have there's a solar cell tree, and there's this human in a fetal position, and the solar cell tree is connected to the human fetal, which is connected to my circuit boards. So I was using technology as a poetic representation, a medium of storytelling, but in a different way. Everything that was put in there was for a reason. So ultimately what the idea was that it would, through getting charged, it would make sounds of the earth. So how earth sound at the core level, how earth sounds at the surface, water, and space. The whole idea was that, so these are prototypes. I always see them as prototypes. I want to see them as large installations that I can build in public spaces. And immerse people in sound, because what's happening in cities are we are building these urban environments which are so disconnected from nature that the people who are inventing things are disconnected from nature. So what's happening is we're making these loops, these echo chambers within cities, and they're not evolving. And I wanted to, through sound, connect people to nature, because for me sound has had a huge impact on the way I think. Now what you're seeing in there are all transparent PCB boards. So you know what PCB boards are? Okay, the motherboard in your computer, the green boards. So I'm making transparent ones. What you're seeing is this is real copper which has been transferred onto perspex. So this is another image how the whole piece looks like. So there's one layer which is coming out of this by being charged by solar cells, but in the process of making it, I realized there were a lot of technical difficulties. So this piece almost took me 2 years to resolve. I realized that solar cells are so small that they're not giving enough energy to play the sound. So I changed it to a light activated system. I'm hoping that when I get commissioned a larger piece, it'll be charged by solar energies, by solar cells. Let's see. And then, so this is a light activated sensor, and then but when you move around it, there's another sound which is imposed. Now that is like your carbon imprinting on that sound, on element earth. So it's an evolving sound composition also. This is about like how we design our urban landscapes, because how we design our landscapes is how we design, it affects our brainscapes, and it's an interconnectivity. So the soundscapes to like the visuals. So it's architecture, technology, nature, and ecology coming in together to talk about this piece. Now, the films, it's basically, there are 2 days in this. So one is a nature-based day from morning to night. And if there is no movement around, it doesn't sense any movement, it stays in the nature paradigm. But as soon as it senses movement, the films disrupts and it becomes, and because I was living in Bombay at that point, was Bombay as a machine. And it's the machine, and it's how we, so this is another sort of frontal design. And you have these LCDs almost like billboards being held by cranes in the bottlescape. I got commissioned by this public art gallery in Perth called Form, and I made this into a 27-foot graphical notation score, so people could actually walk into my copper for the first time. I could afford that, and that was very exciting. Though I would have, I wish the floors were white, then you could see the shadows. I mean, but copper is very difficult to shoot, let's just say that. Okay, so I mean, I have more works, but then what do you think? Like, should I go on? Do you guys have time? Like, I have another sound piece, but that's with a drawing machine. But we could, yeah. Now, basically, I was invited by Jeu de Paume, which is a museum in Paris. They said like, they want to commission me a piece, and they wanted to talk about the effects of digitalization on print media. And I chose specifically the topic of the loss of handwriting, and also the loss that we no longer write letters to one another. Specifically. So the next project I'm working on are the unwanted plants in our ecology. So Goa is like one of the 60 bioreserves across the planet, which not just Goa, it's basically this belt in the Western Ghats. And I've been collecting, I've been just walking around my house and picking up weeds, but not like weed, but weeds, because every time I Google, that's what's coming up, and it's really annoying. So what I'm doing is basically converting all these plants into sound frequencies. And I'm building an informational book on nutritional value and food. It has collagen. So your skin, if you put it in a salad, it remains youthful. So stuff like that. But all 10-15 minutes walking. So it's been a really eco ride on me, like me also trying to connect back to nature, which is why I escaped from Bombay. But also building a vocabulary through research, and building a book so people can read that information and maybe start growing weeds in their houses and rather removing them, and understanding that they are part of our ecosystem. Because even when Wikipedia defines weeds, there's the last line, like humans. Weeds like humans, like the things that just grow abundantly and may not be wanted in that particular space. And that got me thinking, if we are humans and they are weeds, we could actually have a symbiotic relationship. And so I'm exploring this again I have a humidity sensor this time, so if you can blow on it, the sound increases. So obviously I'm going teching out on it a bit. But yes, I'm building a vocabulary again just to transfuse information and communicate these things through sound and electronics.
Wow.